My name is Destiny Butler, and I am 28 years old. 2 years ago, I stood in the cramped kitchen of my Virginia apartment holding my freshly printed master's degree in forensic accounting. I had worked 80-hour weeks balancing ledgers for a mid-sized logistics firm just to cover my tuition. Every paycheck was carefully allocated to ensure I walked across that stage without carrying a single dollar of debt. My parents, Richard and Victoria, had promised to host a celebration dinner that evening at a French bistro in downtown Richmond. It was a rare gesture of recognition. I had even purchased a new dress for the occasion, a structured navy sheath that felt like professional armor. My phone vibrated against the faux granite countertop. It was not a phone call. It was a casual group text from my mother. She wrote that they had to take a rain check on my dinner. Madison. My younger sister had just finalized the date for her engagement gala, and the vendor needed an immediate deposit for the custom ice sculpture she wanted. My parents took the money meant for my graduation dinner and handed it over for a melting block of ice. They wrote that they were swamped reviewing aesthetic boards and told me I would understand. I read the screen 3 times. The blue light illuminated the quiet space of my kitchen. There was no apology for the broken promise. There was no suggestion to reschedule. The betrayal was swift and clinical. They appraised my hard-earned milestone weighted against a frozen swan and decided my achievement did not merit celebration. While I traded my 20s for financial independence, they traded my graduation dinner to secure my sister's social aesthetic. Before I explain the precise mechanics of how I turned their petty cancellation into a financial foreclosure, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Senior Echo Stories. We only want you here if these stories of standing up for yourself truly resonate with your heart. Also, I would love to know how old you are and what time it is where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to that humid evening in Virginia, and the moment I realized my family viewed my success not as an achievement, but as a disposable asset. The moment I set my phone face down on the counter was the exact moment the final thread of my familial obligations snapped. I did not shed a tear. Forensic accounting trains the mind to look at raw data without emotional bias. I looked at the data of my family dynamic. I realized they viewed my success not as a point of pride, but as a self-sustaining mechanism they could afford to ignore until it became useful. My competence was their excuse to neglect me. I hung the navy dress back in my closet, ordered takeout from a local Thai restaurant, and ate dinner alone in the silence of my apartment. To understand the audacity of their cancellation, you have to understand the specific brand of toxic favoritism that defined the Butler household. My parents were masters of the East Coast facade, maintaining a manicured colonial estate while operating on the delusion that image was more important than solvency. I was the sturdy daughter, the reliable scapegoat, who worked grueling shifts to pay for my own textbooks, while Madison was their fragile investment. She was the golden child who received a brand new luxury SUV on her 16th birthday. My parents poured their wealth into Madison's bottomless pit of pageants, boutique vacations, and failed entrepreneurial whims. If I earned a promotion, it was met with a dismissive nod. If Madison experienced a minor inconvenience, it was treated as a national emergency. I spent my 20s building a wall of professional competence to hide the hollow ache where a supportive family should have been. But the cancellation of my graduation party was the final severed tether. I realized that to them, I was not a daughter. I was invisible until they needed something to harvest. I did not know it then, but their decision to cancel on me was the opening move in a high-stakes game that would eventually lock them out of the very luxury they assumed was their birthright. The morning after the canceled graduation dinner, I woke up before dawn. I did not linger in bed or wait for an apology text that I knew would never arrive. I brewed a pot of cheap coffee, ironed my slacks, and drove to the logistics firm. In forensic accounting, the numbers never lie. They do not gaslight you. They do not cancel plans to fund an ice sculpture. They simply present the truth. I sat at my desk overlooking the gray Virginia skyline and opened a corporate ledger. I found comfort in the rigid structure of debits and credits. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic financial theater my parents orchestrated at home. To comprehend the sheer audacity of my family, you have to peer behind the manicured hedges of their East Coast colonial estate. Richard and Victoria Butler functioned on a specific brand of toxic favoritism that treated image as a vital organ and solvency as an optional inconvenience. I was assigned the role of the sturdy daughter early in life. Sturdy is a dangerous label. It sounds like a compliment, but it is actually a shipping manifest. It means you are expected to bear the weight of everyone else without ever cracking. I remember a humid Tuesday afternoon during my sophomore year of college. I had compiled a meticulous folder of my grades and projected earnings to ask my father to act as a co-signer on a low-interest student loan. I needed the funds to cover my textbooks and a mandated software program for my accounting track. Richard sat in his leather armchair swirling a glass of scotch. He barely glanced at my folder. He delivered a practiced lecture about how financial independence builds character. He told me that struggling would give me grit. He refused to sign the paper. The very next day, a flatbed truck pulled into our sweeping circular driveway. It carried a brand new white luxury SUV wrapped in a giant red bow. It was Madison's 16th birthday present. The bow alone cost more than my entire semester of textbooks. Madison was their fragile investment. From the moment she could walk, she was groomed for a high society life my parents could barely afford to maintain. They poured their wealth into her bottomless pit of pageants, boutique vacations, and aesthetic reinventions. While I worked double shifts at a local diner to pay for my own tuition, Madison decided she wanted to launch a bespoke equestrian clothing line. She had never ridden a horse in her life. It did not matter. Richard and Victoria funneled $200,000 into branding, marketing, and inventory. I spent my evenings studying tax law at the kitchen island, while Madison threw tantrums over the exact shade of beige for her custom shipping boxes. The business folded within 8 months. The unsold inventory gathered dust in the estate garage. When I pointed out the negative burn rate of her company, Victoria snapped that I lacked creative vision. They worshipped a country club lifestyle they were quietly drowning to uphold. If I earned a promotion at the firm, it warranted a simple thumbs-up emoji in a group chat. If Madison chipped a manicure before a sorority mixer, it required a family summit and a soothing spa weekend. I spent my 20s constructing a fortified wall of professional competence. I treated my career as a shield to hide the hollow ache where a supportive family should have been. But sitting in my apartment the night of my canceled graduation, that wall finally sealed shut. I realized I was invisible to them until they needed a utility to harvest. For 6 months following the graduation incident, I instituted a strict boundary of silence. I did not call. I did not visit the colonial estate. I treated my family like a closed account. But a narcissist cannot tolerate a boundary they did not establish. The silence was eventually broken, not by an apology, but by an audacious demand for free labor. Madison was planning her engagement gala and the extravagant destination wedding to follow. The aesthetic was spiraling out of control. My phone buzzed on a Tuesday afternoon with an email from Victoria. She attached a chaotic, corrupted spreadsheet filled with red ink and disjointed numbers. The email contained no pleasantries. She did not ask how my career was progressing. She simply stated that the wedding vendors were overcharging them, and she required my forensic accounting skills to audit the catering and floral contracts. She demanded I fix the budget by the weekend. I sat in my office and stared at the screen. They had canceled my milestone dinner to fund this exact wedding, and now they expected me to donate my professional expertise to balance their reckless spending. I did not reply with anger. I replied with a formal invoice template. I stated that my freelance consulting rate was $300 an hour, and I required a $10,000 retainer before initiating any vendor audits. I hit send and waited. The response arrived an hour later, in the form of a blistering voicemail from my father. Richard did not use his corporate negotiation voice. His tone was sharp and frantic. He called me an ungrateful spinster. He accused me of hoarding my wealth while my own flesh and blood suffered under the stress of event planning. He told me that family requires sacrifice and that my transactional mindset was a disgrace to the Butler name. I listened to the voicemail twice. I saved the audio file to a secure folder and deleted the spreadsheet from my inbox. I realized then that my parents were not just entitled. They were starting to panic. The level of venom in Richard's voice indicated a deep structural flaw in their finances. People who actually possess wealth do not scream at their children over a vendor audit. They were bleeding cash, and they wanted me to stop the hemorrhage for free. I turned off my phone and went back to my ledgers. I resolved to remain a ghost. Let them fund their own ruin. The silence resumed, holding steady through the autumn months. I focused entirely on my clients, building my reputation within the firm. I thought the friction was paused indefinitely. I thought I had successfully navigated my way out of their blast radius. I was wrong. The narrative shifted on an unusually cold Thursday morning in November. I was sitting in a glass boardroom preparing for a client presentation when my personal cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed a number from downtown Richmond that I did not recognize. It was not Richard. It was not Victoria. I excused myself from the room and answered the call in the quiet hallway. A man with a calm, measured voice introduced himself as Arthur Caldwell. He was a senior estate attorney. He asked if I was Destiny Butler. I confirmed my identity, feeling a sudden drop in the temperature of my blood. Mr. Caldwell informed me that my grandmother Evelyn had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous night. I leaned against the cool glass wall of the corridor. Evelyn was a force of nature. She was a sharp, pragmatic woman who had built a lucrative hospitality empire from the ground up. She suffered zero fools and possessed a terrifying ability to read the true character of anyone in her presence. She was the only person in the entire Butler bloodline who respected my mind. While Richard and Victoria paraded around the country club, Evelyn used to sit with me on her porch, drinking black coffee and discussing supply chain logistics. She saw right through the Virginia colonial facade my parents worked so hard to maintain. She understood the difference between a depreciating asset and a long-term investment. Mr. Caldwell did not offer empty condolences. He spoke with the clinical precision of a man executing a final command. He requested my immediate presence at his downtown office the following morning. He stated that Evelyn had established a private blind trust, and the reading of the documents required my signature before the rest of the family was notified. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the gray city streets. The ground beneath my feet was shifting. The 6 months of silence, the canceled dinners, the financial demands, it was all mere prologue. Evelyn had spent decades watching her son drain her accounts to fund Madison's lifestyle. She knew exactly what kind of predators she was leaving behind. A new storm was gathering on the horizon, and my grandmother had just handed me the lightning rod. I drove to the downtown Richmond law firm the morning after Mr. Caldwell delivered the news of my grandmother's passing over the phone. He did not hand me any documents during that initial brief encounter. He simply sat behind his polished desk and informed me that Evelyn had engineered a highly specific legal sequence. He instructed me to attend the upcoming funeral, observe my parents' behavior, and return to my apartment to wait for a formal certified letter. He advised me to remain entirely silent regarding my visit to his office. He said Evelyn wanted me to see the reality of the Butler family dynamic one last time before the ground shifted beneath their feet. 3 days later, I stood under a dark canopy in a damp Virginia cemetery. The air was thick with humidity and the performative grief of my family. Victoria wore a designer black veil that seemed better suited for a theatrical production than a burial. She dabbed her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief whenever a country club acquaintance walked past. Richard stood near the casket, shaking hands with local business owners like a politician running for re-election. He did not look like a man mourning the loss of his mother. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery and was impatiently waiting for the oversized check to clear. I stood near the back of the gathering, offering no empty pleasantries to the attendees. I watched Madison complain to her fiancé Trent that the moisture in the air was ruining her professional blowout. She stood 10 feet away from our grandmother's resting place typing frantically on her phone to her wedding planners. I overheard Richard speaking in hushed tones to a bank executive near the parked limousines. My father boasted that he was about to assume control of the Evelyn Butler Hospitality Trust. He claimed the upcoming liquidity would allow him to expand his own portfolio and easily cover the exorbitant costs of Madison's upcoming destination wedding. As a forensic accountant, I observed patterns. I watched my father brag about unearned capital and realized he was operating on pure financial delusion. He was already spending an inheritance he had not yet received. Evelyn had built her empire from a single rundown beachfront motel in the 70s, transforming it into a lucrative portfolio through sheer grit and relentless labor. Richard had always resented her calloused hands and pragmatic mindset because he preferred the illusion of effortless high society wealth. He viewed her death not as a tragedy, but as a timely rescue from his own mounting debts. I kept my face neutral, zipped my coat, and left the cemetery before the reception began. I followed the instructions of the estate attorney and waited in the silence of my apartment. The silence following that funeral lasted exactly 6 months. During that half year, Richard and Victoria lived in a state of suspended animation. Probate courts in Virginia moved slowly, and my parents assumed the legal delays were standard bureaucratic hurdles. They continued to bleed cash funding Madison's, escalating bridal demands on credit while waiting for the golden parachute to deploy. I focused on my ledgers tracking supply chains for my corporate clients and ignoring the rare passive-aggressive group texts from my mother complaining about legal red tape. Then the waiting period abruptly concluded. A week after the 6-month anniversary of the funeral, I received a certified letter in my mail slot. The heavy parchment bore the gold-embossed seal of Mr. Caldwell's firm. It was a formal summons requesting my presence at his downtown Richmond office the following afternoon. I assumed the lengthy probate process had finally untangled. I calculated that Evelyn had likely left me a small savings account, or perhaps a modest treasury bond. I figured it might be just enough to clear my remaining student loans and provide a small buffer for my savings. I arrived at the law firm 10 minutes early. Mr. Caldwell escorted me into his corner office and closed the heavy oak door, muting the sounds of the city traffic below. The room smelled of old paper leather and serious money. There were no flashy red bows or performative aesthetic boards here. This was a room where permanent decisions were executed. He sat across from me, interlacing his fingers and fixing me with a direct, unblinking stare. He did not hand me a check. He did not mention a savings account. He bypassed the standard pleasantries and slid a heavy manila envelope across the smooth mahogany desk. Mr. Caldwell explained that Evelyn possessed a brilliant analytical mind. She had recognized Richard's weakness decades ago. She knew her son lacked the discipline to manage a hospitality empire and possessed an incurable addiction to social climbing. Over the past 3 years, Evelyn had hired her own private financial investigators to audit Richard's public filings. She watched him leverage the Virginia colonial estate to the hilt. She tracked the $200,000 he wasted on Madison's failed equestrian business. She observed the current catastrophic hemorrhage of funds flowing toward the upcoming engagement gala and destination wedding. Evelyn knew that if her assets went through the standard probate process, Richard would liquidate her life's work within 12 months. She knew he would pawn her legacy to pay off his shadow debts and fund a shallow, pathetic performance of wealth for the country club elite. I reached out and unclasped the metal tie on the manila envelope. I pulled out a stack of thick, crisp legal stock. I scanned the first page and my eyes locked on the property title. It was not a simple financial inheritance. It was a commercial real estate deed. Mr. Caldwell leaned forward and illuminated the reality of the document holding my name. Evelyn had not left me a house. She had left me Azure Cove. I felt the air leave my lungs. Azure Cove was not a standard boutique hotel. It was the crown jewel of Evelyn's entire hospitality portfolio. It was an ultra-exclusive five-star luxury resort located on a private peninsula in the Florida Keys. I had visited the property once as a teenager and remembered the sheer scale of the operation. It featured a network of private oceanfront villas, a deep-water marina capable of docking luxury yachts, and a heavily guarded biometric security system. It was a multi-million-dollar tropical fortress that catered to international executives and high-net-worth individuals. Mr. Caldwell stated that the property was legally irrevocably in my name. Evelyn had bypassed my parents entirely. She had utilized a sophisticated blind trust to transfer the deed to me prior to her death, thereby shielding the asset from the probate courts and Richard's greedy hands. The transfer was already recorded with the state. I was not just a beneficiary. I was the sole managing director of a premier luxury estate. I looked at the legal seals on the parchment. The ink was dry. The reality settled into my bones with a cold, heavy certainty. My grandmother had watched Richard and Victoria drain their own accounts to spoil a golden child who respected nothing. She saw the storm of insolvency approaching their doorstep. Evelyn had decided to secure the perimeter. She handed the keys to the only person in the Butler family who understood the true value of hard work. I set the deed down on the mahogany desk. I realized the 6 months of silence was not a bureaucratic delay. It was a calculated buffer designed to let the property transfer settle into ironclad legal stone. I also realized the terrifying implication of this document. Richard and Victoria were currently living on borrowed time and borrowed money. They were marching toward Madison's extravagant wedding, fully expecting to use Azure Cove as their personal ATM to balance their ruined ledgers. The moment they discovered they had been entirely cut out of the inheritance, the illusion of their East Coast royalty would shatter. They would not just be angry, they would be desperate. And desperate people do not surrender quietly. I stared at the thick, crisp legal stock of the deed resting on the polished mahogany desk. The realization hit my chest like a physical blow. The document in front of me was not a symbolic gesture, it was the key to an empire. Mr. Caldwell pushed a secondary leather-bound folder across the table. It contained the operational blueprints and the current financial ledgers for Azure Cove. I opened the file and let my eyes scan the columns of data. As a forensic accountant, I evaluate the health of an entity through its revenue streams and structural assets. The numbers printed on those pages were staggering. Azure Cove was not a quaint boutique hotel. It was a multi-million-dollar tropical fortress. The blueprints detailed a sprawling network of private oceanfront villas nestled into the lush foliage of the Florida Keys. The property featured a deep-water marina engineered to dock luxury yachts and a private helipad for high-net-worth guests. But the most striking feature was the security infrastructure. Evelyn had poured significant capital into retrofitting the entire compound. The administrative offices, the private owner's suites, and the main gate were governed by a heavily guarded biometric security system. Evelyn installed digital passcodes and thumbprint scanners 2 years prior. She designed the resort to be impenetrable. I looked up from the blueprints. I asked Mr. Caldwell why my grandmother had instituted such extreme security measures at a hospitality venue. He interlaced his fingers and offered a grim smile. He stated that Evelyn was a tactical mastermind. She spent decades reading the true character of her own greedy son. She knew Richard possessed an insatiable appetite for unearned status and a terrifying lack of financial discipline. I remembered a tense Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. Richard had cornered Evelyn in the kitchen. He tried to convince her to remortgage a successful beachfront property in North Carolina to fund his entry into an elite golf and equestrian club in Virginia. He argued that the membership would unlock crucial networking opportunities for his supposed real estate ventures. Evelyn looked at his tailored suit and his desperate eyes. She set her wine glass down and told him that real wealth is built with calluses and late nights, not with country club dues. She denied his request and left the room. Richard shattered a salad plate against the sink the moment she was out of earshot. Evelyn knew that the moment her heart stopped beating, Richard and Victoria would attempt to seize Azure Cove. She knew they would bypass the preservation of her legacy and immediately sell the resort to the highest bidder. They needed a monumental cash injection to cover their mounting hidden debts and to finance the extravagant destination wedding Madison was currently planning. Evelyn understood that her life's work would be liquidated within weeks to pay for imported ice sculptures and designer gowns. To prevent this tragedy, Evelyn engineered a professional-grade trap. Mr. Caldwell explained the mechanics of the blind trust. By transferring the deed directly to me while she was still alive, she bypassed the standard probate courts entirely. The asset never entered her public estate. It vanished from the board before Richard even knew the game had started. She built an impenetrable wall around the property using ironclad legal stipulations. I turned the page and read the specific clauses governing my ownership. The language was sharp and unforgiving. I was named the sole beneficiary and the exclusive managing director of Azure Cove. My parents held zero equity and zero administrative authority. But the brilliance of the document rested in a specific poison pill provision. Evelyn anticipated that Richard would try to challenge the trust. She knew he would attempt to use his status as her son to leverage the property. The will contained a trigger clause. If my parents attempted to encumber the property in any way, if they tried to use Azure Cove as collateral for a loan, or attempted to force a sale, they would trigger an automatic legal lockout. This clause dictated that any hostile legal action against the deed would result in a permanent restraining order, barring them from the premises. It also stated that any attempt to claim the resort would forfeit the minor retirement annuities Evelyn had set aside for them. It was a flawless mechanism of deterrence. Mr. Caldwell leaned across the desk. He told me that Evelyn had handed me the ultimate truth weapon. But a trap only works if the prey does not see the wire. He demanded strict silence. I was instructed to sign the acceptance documents and return to my life in Virginia as if nothing had changed. I could not confront my parents. I could not warn them. I had to let them continue their reckless spending. I had to let them operate under the delusion that they were the heirs to the kingdom until the very last possible moment. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting beside the documents. I signed my name on the dotted line. The ink sank into the paper binding me to the estate. I thanked Mr. Caldwell, gathered the folders, and walked out of the downtown Richmond high-rise. The afternoon air felt different. I was no longer just a sturdy daughter scraping by in a cramped apartment. I was the silent owner of a tropical fortress. I drove home and locked the deed inside a fireproof safe hidden in my bedroom closet. The following weeks tested my discipline. I returned to my forensic accounting firm and processed corporate tax returns during the day. At night, I logged into the secure administrative portal for Azure Cove using the credentials Mr. Caldwell provided. I reviewed the occupancy rates and the staff payrolls. I watched the revenue flow into accounts that I now controlled. Meanwhile, the theater of the Butler family continued across town. I monitored Madison's public social media feeds. She posted daily updates regarding her wedding planning. The aesthetic boards had evolved into concrete contracts. She uploaded videos touring expensive catering facilities and trying on custom silk gowns. She complained about the slow probate process, lamenting that her grandmother's funds were tied up in legal red tape. She had no idea the funds she was waiting for did not exist. Richard and Victoria were funding these exorbitant deposits on credit cards and shadow loans, waiting for a payout that was already sitting in my bedroom closet. The tension was a living, breathing entity in my apartment. I knew the silence could not last forever. An asset the size of Azure Cove creates a heavy footprint in the financial world. Estate taxes, property registries, and corporate insurance policies all require routine processing. Someone was bound to notice the title transfer. My strict adherence to Evelyn's mandate of silence held strong for 3 weeks. The breaking point did not come from my own actions. It came from a careless error in the luxury real estate sector. A commercial broker in Florida who handled neighboring properties ran a routine title search on the Azure Cove Peninsula for a prospective buyer. The broker noticed the recent transfer from the Evelyn Butler Hospitality Trust to a private holding company registered under my name. Seeking a potential commission, the broker tracked down my father's business phone number in Virginia, assuming Richard was the manager of the family portfolio. The broker called Richard to congratulate him on the strategic internal transfer and inquired if the new owner was interested in selling some adjacent marina slips. The broker mentioned my name. The bomb detonated. The quiet shadows where Evelyn and I had operated vanished in an instant. The false peace of the Virginia colonial estate shattered. My phone rang on a cold Tuesday evening. It was a summons. The screen displayed my mother's name, but the text message contained the cold dictating tone of my father. They commanded my immediate presence at the family estate. The war had officially moved into the light. The iron gates of the Virginia estate swung open to reveal the sweeping gravel driveway. I parked my modest sedan behind my father's imported luxury vehicle. The house stood as a pristine monument to East Coast old money architecture. The white columns were spotless. The manicured hedges formed rigid geometric lines. Every brick was positioned to broadcast an image of unshakable prosperity. Walking up the brick pathway, I felt the familiar weight of the Butler family facade. It was a physical environment designed to intimidate visitors and enforce a strict hierarchy. I had spent my childhood shrinking myself to fit inside that hierarchy. Tonight I arrived holding the keys to a property worth more than their entire zip code. Victoria waited for me in the grand foyer. She wore a tailored silk blouse and her signature pearls. She offered a tight performative smile that did not reach her eyes. She did not hug me. She did not offer a greeting. She simply gestured toward the formal dining room. The air in the house felt dense. It carried the scent of expensive catered food and floor wax. I stepped into the dining room. The mahogany table was set for a high-stakes negotiation disguised as a family dinner. It was a masterclass in financial delusion. A towering centerpiece of imported white orchids dominated the center of the table. Crystal goblets caught the light from the antique chandelier. Fine silver cutlery flanked bone china plates. Richard sat at the head of the table wearing a stiff suit jacket. Madison and her fiancé Trent sat on the opposite side. Madison wore a designer cocktail dress, checking her reflection in the blade of her butter knife. Trent looked nervous, pulling at the collar of his shirt. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table. The catering staff brought out plates of roasted duck and poured red wine. The silence in the room was heavy. Nobody touched their food. In the logistics of corporate management, you learn to recognize the posture of a failing executive. Richard was leaning forward, his shoulders rigid, his hands clasped tightly over his plate. He possessed a lifelong habit of treating his family like subordinate employees. He spent his career as a mid-level manager who bought suits he could not afford to project an authority he did not possess. Tonight, he was prepared to leverage every ounce of that false authority against me. Richard dismissed the catering staff with a sharp wave of his hand. He bypassed the customary small talk entirely. He deployed his practiced corporate negotiation voice. It was a tone engineered to make the listener feel small and incompetent. He looked down the length of the table and began a clinical character assassination of his own mother. He stated that the family needed to address an uncomfortable reality regarding Evelyn's final months. He claimed that our grandmother was slipping. He used words like cognitive decline and irrational paranoia. He wove a fictional narrative detailing how Evelyn had become confused and vulnerable to outside manipulation. He painted a picture of a sick elderly woman who lost her grip on reality and made a frantic mistake. I sat still and listened to the lies. Evelyn possessed a mind sharper than a steel trap until the minute she stopped breathing. She oversaw complex hospitality portfolios and analyzed market trends with ruthless precision. The only thing she lost in her final years was her tolerance for Richard's financial incompetence. My father reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor. He pulled out a blue legal folder and slid it across the smooth mahogany surface. The folder stopped inches from my plate. He instructed me to open it. I flipped the cover. Resting inside was a standard quitclaim deed. It was drafted by a local real estate attorney. The document was designed to transfer the sole ownership of Azure Cove from my name directly into the Evelyn Butler Hospitality Trust, which Richard now controlled. Richard delivered his ultimatum. He stated that the deed transfer Evelyn executed before her death was a cognitive error. He claimed it was a symptom of a sick mind that required immediate legal correction. He framed the quitclaim document not as a demand, but as a family duty. He told me that signing the paper was the only way to protect the Butler legacy and restore the natural order of the estate. He produced a gold pen and tapped it against the crystal goblet, ordering me to sign my name. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the dining room air. He expected me to surrender a multi-million-dollar tropical fortress based on a fabricated medical diagnosis. Before I could formulate a response, Victoria initiated the secondary phase of the ambush. She played the role of the wounded peacemaker. She reached out and placed a comforting hand on Madison's shoulder. Victoria spoke with a soft, trembling voice, claiming that this ordeal was causing the family unnecessary stress during a joyful season. She shifted the focus away from Evelyn's supposed mental state and placed the burden directly onto Madison's future. Victoria claimed that Madison desperately needed Azure Cove. My sister was attempting to build a lifestyle brand to secure her place in high society. A brand built on nothing requires a spectacular backdrop to survive. Victoria argued that the Florida resort was the only venue suitable to serve as the headquarters for Madison's new married identity. She insisted that transferring the deed was not about money. It was about supporting a sister who needed a proper foundation to thrive among the Virginia elite. Madison leaned forward, her eyes wide with unearned entitlement. She did not ask for my help. She demanded my compliance. She spoke about aesthetic visions and influencer marketing strategies. She claimed she had already promised her country club friends a VIP experience at the private oceanfront villas. She talked about the resort as if it were a new handbag she was eager to show off. Trent sat silently beside her, staring at his plate, clearly realizing he was marrying into a family unmoored from reality. I looked at the blue folder. I looked at the imported orchids and the crystal goblets. Then I looked my father directly in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. The forensic accountant inside me took control of the narrative. I recognized that this entire dinner was a desperate theatrical production. Wealthy, secure individuals do not slide quitclaim deeds across dinner tables. They do not invent medical conditions to steal from their children. They do not rely on their youngest daughter's lifestyle brand to save their legacy. I reached out and closed the blue folder. I pushed it back across the table. The thick paper scraped against the polished wood. I told Richard that Evelyn beat me at a complex game of chess 3 weeks before she died. I stated that her cognitive function was flawless, and her legal trap was ironclad. I informed my family that the blind trust was sealed and the deed was secure. I refused to sign the paper. The silence that followed was distinct. It was the sound of an illusion breaking. Richard's face turned a deep mottled red. The veins in his neck strained against his tailored collar. Victoria gasped, pulling her hand away from Madison as if the air had suddenly turned cold. The performative warmth evaporated, leaving behind the stark reality of their true nature. I stood up from my chair and smoothed the fabric of my trousers. I turned my back on the lavish dinner and walked toward the grand foyer. No one tried to stop me. No one followed me to the door. As I walked down the brick pathway toward my car, the humid evening air cleared my mind. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into a terrifying picture. They did not view my success as an achievement. They viewed my professional competence as a backup fund waiting to be liquidated. The aggression I witnessed in that dining room was not born from simple greed. It was fueled by an underlying invisible terror. They needed Azure Cove too badly. The desperation in my father's voice, when he pushed that document toward me, revealed a hidden truth. The colonial estate, the imported orchids, the luxury vehicles, they were all props. I started the engine of my car and drove down the sweeping driveway, leaving the iron gates behind. I knew the war was just beginning. If they were willing to orchestrate an ambush of that magnitude to steal an inheritance, they were hiding a financial catastrophe that threatened to consume them all. I needed to see their ledgers. I needed to find out exactly how much debt they were trying to bury under the white sand of my resort. I drove through the dark Virginia streets, gripping the steering wheel with a quiet intensity. The confrontation at the dining room table played on a continuous loop in my mind. My father's reddened face and my mother's sudden gasp told a story that contradicted their tailored clothes and imported orchids. In my profession, you learn that human behavior is often a sophisticated smokescreen for financial distress. People who possess genuine wealth do not ambush their children over dinner to demand property transfers. I parked my car in the small lot of my apartment building, walked up the stairs, and locked the door behind me. I did not turn on the television or pour a glass of wine to decompress. I went straight to my desk and opened my laptop. As a forensic accountant, my brain is hardwired for efficiency and tracking subtle discrepancies. I know exactly how to identify a hidden drain on any financial system. I opened an encrypted browser window and began a quiet surgical audit of my own family. I started with the most accessible public records. Property taxes, county registries, and municipal liens are open to anyone who knows where to look. I typed in the address of the Virginia Colonial Estate. The initial search yielded a standard deed registered to Richard and Victoria Butler, but the encumbrance history painted a terrifying picture of insolvency. Growing up, Richard always boasted about his diverse real estate portfolios and exclusive investment groups. He treated his finances like classified state secrets, claiming his market strategies were too complex for a young girl to understand. I spent my teenage years believing my father was a financial titan who simply expected me to forge my own path. I remembered a summer when I was 15. Richard hosted a lavish catered barbecue for his country club friends, but I later overheard him screaming at the landscaping contractor over a disputed invoice for a few $100s. The digital ledger glowing on my screen proved that the barbecue was the rule and the unpaid contractor was the reality. The colonial estate was leveraged to the hilt. Richard had taken out a second mortgage 5 years ago. He followed that with a third line of credit just 18 months prior. The equity in the property was virtually non-existent. They did not own a sprawling mansion. They owned a towering stack of high-interest debt secured by a brick facade. I dug deeper, cross-referencing the property records with Richard's corporate filings. He operated a small holding company designed to manage his supposed assets. I accessed the state business registry and pulled the annual reports and public tax filings. The company was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. The liquid capital was evaporating. I traced the outgoing transfers matching the dates to major events in our family history to build a cohesive timeline. The numbers aligned perfectly with Madison's extravagant lifestyle. I found the corresponding withdrawal for her luxury vehicle purchase. I tracked the devastating sinkhole of her failed equestrian clothing line. $200,000 vanished in less than a year, paying for useless branding and unsold inventory. But the most alarming data points were recent. Over the past 3 months, my parents had been liquidating stable blue-chip stocks and draining their primary mutual funds. They were pawning their lifeboats to fund an aesthetic they could no longer afford to maintain. I matched the dates of the stock sales to Madison's wedding planning timeline. A major portfolio liquidation occurred 2 days before Madison announced she secured a celebrity disc jockey for her reception. Another mutual fund was emptied the same week Victoria bragged about importing custom silk table linens from Italy. My parents were funding a destination wedding using the last drops of their retirement savings. They were operating on a terrifying deficit, hoping to cross the finish line before the checks began to bounce. The reality of their situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the ceiling of my apartment. The dynamic at the dinner table suddenly made perfect sense. They did not just want Azure Cove so Madison could host charity galas and show off to her high society friends. That was the palatable lie they sold to each other to maintain their pride. The truth was far more desperate and much more dangerous. They were actively trying to steal my inheritance because they were drowning in a sea of red ink. If Richard could transfer the deed of a premier Florida resort into his own name, he could use the unencumbered property as pristine physical collateral. He could secure a shadow loan to cover his mounting debts, pay off the lines of credit, and save the Virginia estate from imminent foreclosure. Evelyn's tropical fortress was their only ticket out of bankruptcy. The pressure I witnessed in the dining room was not born from simple greed or entitlement. It was pure, unadulterated survival. My father pushed that quitclaim deed across the table because he was staring at total financial ruin. I closed the browser tabs and locked my computer screen. The lingering fear and childhood intimidation I held toward my parents dissolved entirely. It was replaced by a cold, tactical clarity. They were no longer untouchable East Coast royalty sitting on a pedestal of generational wealth. They were desperate debtors clutching at straws. I held the keys to their salvation, and I had just refused to hand them over. I realized that Evelyn had given me more than a property. She had given me the power to audit my own bloodline and expose the hollow core of their existence. I knew my refusal would not end the war. Desperate people do not surrender when their survival is threatened. They escalate their tactics and aim for vulnerable targets. If Richard and Victoria could not force me to sign the deed in the privacy of their dining room, they would try to break my resolve in the public square. My prediction materialized faster than I anticipated. The next morning, I arrived at my accounting firm feeling a renewed sense of focus. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at my desk preparing to review a complex client file. My office phone rang, disrupting the quiet morning routine. It was not a client calling with a tax question. It was a senior partner at the firm. He requested my presence in his office immediately, and his tone left no room for delay. I walked down the carpeted hallway and knocked on his heavy glass door. The partner gestured for me to enter and instructed me to close the blinds. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask about my weekend. He looked at me with a mixture of deep concern and professional distance. He informed me that he had attended a high-profile charity luncheon the previous afternoon, hosted by a prominent local philanthropic board. He stated that Victoria Butler was the guest of honor. My mother had taken the stage at the country club event. She stood in front of influential women, local politicians, and corporate executives. The partner told me she wept openly, holding a silk handkerchief to dry her tears. She delivered a fabricated tragedy to the attentive crowd. She painted a picture of a predatory daughter who had manipulated an elderly, dementia-ridden woman. She claimed I had isolated my grandmother and coerced her into signing over her last remaining asset while my parents were busy caring for her declining health. The partner leaned across his desk and folded his hands. He explained that our forensic accounting firm thrives on unwavering trust and impeccable moral character. He said several wealthy clients had approached him after the luncheon questioning my integrity and requesting new account managers. My mother was not just complaining about a family dispute to her friends. She was weaponizing her social network to strangle my career. She intended to destroy my professional reputation, hoping that if I lost my high-end accounting clients, I would lose my income. She calculated that a desperate, unemployed daughter would be forced to surrender Azure Cove just to survive the year. The siege had officially moved from the dining room table to the corporate boardroom. The glass walls of the senior partner's office felt like a transparent cage. He sat across from me expecting a tearful defense or a panicked explanation regarding the sudden toxicity surrounding my name. In the realm of high finance scandal is a liability that requires swift containment. He folded his hands over his polished mahogany desk and outlined the exact damage my mother was inflicting across the Richmond Country Club circuit. Victoria was hosting catered luncheons specifically targeting the wives of our firm's top corporate clients. She performed the role of the grieving betrayed matriarch with terrifying skill. She wept over plates of imported endive, claiming I had preyed upon Evelyn's declining mental state. She told these influential women that I isolated a sick grandmother and forced her to sign away her life savings while my parents were busy arranging her medical care. The narrative was a calculated inversion of reality. Victoria understood that in the upper echelons of Virginia society, perception held significantly more weight than truth. If she could brand me as a predator, she could choke off my client base. A forensic accountant relies entirely on trust and unimpeachable ethics. If corporate boards believed I was capable of elder abuse, they would strip my contracts without hesitation. Without my steady income, the exorbitant property taxes and maintenance fees for Azure Cove would quickly bury me. Victoria was executing a financial siege designed to starve me into submission, so I would hand over the deed just to survive. I looked at the partner and maintained a neutral expression. I did not offer a frantic denial because panic is the currency of the guilty. I calmly asked him for the names of the clients who had threatened to pull their accounts. He listed 3 major logistics corporations and a regional hospital network. I recognized the accounts immediately. I had spent the last 2 years untangling their bloated ledgers and securing their financial compliance. To understand Victoria's proficiency in character assassination, you have to examine her history. When I was 19, I secured a prestigious summer internship at a downtown investment bank through grueling interviews and top academic marks. Madison wanted the same position, despite having zero background in finance, simply because the office was located next to a high-end shopping district. Victoria did not ask me to step down. She invited the hiring manager to a charity gala and casually mentioned my supposed struggles with reliability and minor substance abuse. The firm rescinded my offer the next morning and handed the internship to my sister. Madison quit 3 weeks later because the dress code was too restrictive. Victoria treated reputations like disposable stepping stones to elevate her golden child. Now she was applying that exact same tactic to obliterate my entire career. The rumors metastasized rapidly through the elite circles of Richmond. 2 weeks after the meeting in the partner's office, I attended a regional finance symposium at a downtown banquet hall. It was a mandatory networking event for senior associates. I wore a tailored gray suit and kept my posture rigid. The atmosphere inside the venue was chilling. I approached a table of banking executives I had collaborated with for years. The conversation halted the second I arrived. Polite smiles vanished into thin, tight lines. Handshakes were brief and uncomfortable. People invented immediate excuses to walk toward the bar or check their phones. I stood near a marble pillar holding a glass of sparkling water, feeling an invisible quarantine drop around me. My mother had successfully poisoned the well. She knew these people sat on the boards of the companies I audited. She was leveraging her country club influence to suffocate my livelihood from the outside in. The tension culminated later that evening. The senior partner found me near the coat check area. He pulled me aside into a quiet alcove, his expression drawn and fatigued. He stated that the board of our largest hospital client was formally requesting my removal from their upcoming annual audit. They cited concerns regarding my moral character and potential liability. He rubbed his temples and suggested I take an indefinite leave of absence to manage my family dispute. He framed the suspension as a protective measure for the firm, but I knew it was a polite termination. I set my glass down on a nearby side table. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I woke the screen and navigated to the hospital network's secure encrypted file. I turned the device toward the partner. I did not speak about my grandmother or the lies my mother peddled over lunch. I spoke the only language a corporate accounting firm truly values. I pointed to a column of figures highlighted in bright green. I reminded him that during the previous fiscal quarter, my forensic analysis uncovered a deep structural redundancy in the hospital's billing department. My specific audit recovered $3 million in lost revenue. I swiped to the next tab displaying the logistics company account. I showed him how my tax optimization strategy shielded them from a rigorous federal penalty, saving their shareholders 7 figures. I kept my voice clinical and detached. I told the partner that my personal ethics were reflected in those ledgers. I stated that Virginia high society thrives on baseless gossip, but corporate shareholders demand measurable profit. I forced him to evaluate the situation through a purely financial lens. I asked him if he was willing to sacrifice millions of dollars in recovered revenue for his clients simply because a woman cried at a country club luncheon. I challenged him to call the hospital board in the morning and explain that they were losing their most effective auditor over an unsubstantiated society rumor. The partner stared at the glowing screen. He looked at the hard, undeniable data. The numbers provided a stabilizing anchor in a sea of social panic. He slowly closed the laptop and handed it back to me. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. He stated that he would personally handle the hospital board and ensure my position on the account remained secure. I won the battle in that quiet alcove. The firm would continue to back me as long as I produced flawless, lucrative results. But the victory felt sharp and exhausting. I drove back to my apartment realizing the true scope of the war I was fighting. My parents were willing to scorch the earth to get what they wanted. They did not care if I ended up bankrupt and unemployed. They viewed my destruction as necessary collateral damage to secure their shadow loan and save their colonial estate. The siege had officially begun. Victoria failed to sever my income, but she proved she could mobilize the entire social infrastructure of Richmond against me. I was insulated by my professional competence, but I was entirely isolated from my community. I sat at my kitchen counter and opened my secure email portal. I needed to check the administrative logs for Azure Cove to ensure the property taxes and payroll accounts were processing correctly. My accounting career was safe for the moment, but the Florida resort required constant vigilance. I typed in my encrypted password and accessed the management dashboard. A red notification flag blinked in the top corner of the screen. It was a high-priority alert from the resort's concierge desk down in the Keys. I clicked the notification and read the attached incident report. My pulse accelerated as my eyes scanned the text. The threat was no longer confined to the gossip circles of Virginia. Earlier that afternoon, a woman had contacted the Azure Cove Management Office claiming to be the new primary resident. She sent a frantic email demanding the immediate termination of the current event staff. She stated she was bringing in her own aesthetic coordinators and instructed the front desk to grant her team full unsupervised access to the private oceanfront villas. The sender of the email was Madison. My sister was not waiting for the legal dust to settle or for my parents to force a signature. She was attempting to execute a hostile takeover of the property from 800 miles away. She truly believed the resort belonged to her by right of birth, and she was trying to break through the front gate using sheer entitlement. The smear campaign, orchestrated by my mother, was just a distraction to keep me occupied. The real invasion was currently happening on my own soil, and the Golden Child was leading the charge. The red notification icon blinked against the dark background of my management portal. I opened the incident report forwarded by the front desk of Azure Cove. Attached was a direct email sent to the resort's general inbox just an hour prior. The sender was Madison. While my mother spent her afternoons weeping in country club dining rooms, attempting to starve my career, Madison operated on a different frequency. My sister treated her impending nuptials like a reality television broadcast, and she decided her season finale required a tropical backdrop she did not own. I read the contents of the email. Madison's tone was breathtakingly arrogant. She introduced herself to the resort staff as the new primary resident and the incoming director of operations. She did not ask for a consultation. She issued a mandate. She instructed the general manager to terminate the current event coordination team by the end of the week. She claimed their aesthetic vision was outdated and stated she was flying in her own team of boutique designers to overhaul the private oceanfront villas. She demanded unrestricted access to the property's secure marina and ordered the staff to begin clearing the main terrace for a celebrity disc jockey she had just booked. Madison had spent her entire life insulated from the word no. If a high school dance venue lacked the proper lighting, Victoria hired private contractors to rewire the gymnasium. If a sorority event failed to meet her standards, Richard wrote a check to upgrade the catering. My parents taught her that reality was a flexible concept that always bent to her desires. Now she was attempting to bend a premier luxury resort to her will from 800 miles away. She truly believed that projecting authority would manifest ownership, I opened a separate browser tab and navigated to Madison's public social media feed. The digital performance provided a stark contrast to the financial ruin I had uncovered in my father's corporate filings. Madison uploaded a video montage earlier that morning from a bespoke bridal atelier. She twirled in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror, wearing a custom silk gown that cost more than a standard vehicle. In the caption, she boasted about securing an exclusive Las Vegas music producer for her reception. She tagged Azure Cove as the venue, framing the pristine beaches as her personal playground. The disconnect was terrifying. My parents were bleeding cash, liquidating their final retirement funds and pawning their lifeboats to sustain this illusion. Yet Madison continued to spend with reckless abandon. She flaunted the financial hemorrhage in real time, oblivious to the fact that her parents were steering the family estate toward a cliff. Or perhaps she did know and simply did not care as long as the champagne kept flowing. Her email to the resort, however, proved she was growing impatient. She needed physical control of the venue to legitimize her social media boasts. She tried to execute a hostile takeover by proxy, assuming the staff would bow to her demands. She underestimated the infrastructure Evelyn left behind. Azure Cove did not operate like a standard hotel. Evelyn engineered the property to protect high-net-worth clients and international executives. The concierge team was trained to verify every administrative directive through a strict chain of command. When Madison sent her list of demands, the general manager immediately checked the incoming email address against the authorized owner registry. He then requested a biometric verification code to process the staffing changes. Madison obviously failed to provide the cryptographic signature because she did not possess it. The system recognized the mismatch, flagged the interaction as a security breach, and locked down the administrative portal. The alert sent to my screen was the digital equivalent of a tripped alarm wire. Madison actively attempted to bypass the front gate and break into my property. The quiet threats and the social manipulation were over. The conflict was no longer a theoretical debate over a dinner table. It was a tangible assault on my commercial asset. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line to the security director at Azure Cove. A man named Marcus answered on the second ring. Marcus was a former private military contractor Evelyn hired 5 years ago to overhaul the physical security of the peninsula. He spoke with a calm, measured cadence that inspired immediate confidence. I did not exchange pleasantries. I identified myself via my security clearance pin and explained the situation. I informed Marcus that the individual attempting to commandeer the event staff was my sister. I stated that the Butler family was currently undergoing a hostile internal dispute regarding the estate. I gave him a clear, unwavering directive. I instructed him to enter Richard, Victoria, and Madison into the resort's permanent threat registry. I laid out the protocols. If any member of my family attempted to contact the front desk, the staff was to terminate the call immediately. If they attempted to alter a reservation book, a villa, or hire a vendor, the request was to be denied without explanation. Most importantly, I told Marcus that if my parents or my sister physically arrived at the main gate, they were to be turned away. If they refused to leave the premises, security was authorized to contact local law enforcement and have them removed for trespassing. I required my explicit biometric override for any exception to these rules. Marcus confirmed the instructions, repeating the protocols back to me with professional detachment. He updated the digital registry while we remained on the line. I heard the satisfying click of his keyboard confirming the lockdown. The tropical fortress was officially sealed. I ended the call and set my phone down on the kitchen counter. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had drawn a hard line in the sand. My family assumed they could bully their way into my inheritance through a combination of social pressure and arrogant demands. They were about to discover that a multi-million-dollar property answers to a deed, not a temper tantrum. I walked over to my refrigerator to pour a glass of cold water. My mind churned, processing the next logical outcome. By locking them out of the resort system, I had severed their ability to plan the wedding on their own terms. Madison would soon receive a rejection notice from the concierge. She would run to Richard and Victoria crying about the defiant staff. The reality of their lack of ownership would hit them with the force of a freight train. Before I could take a sip of water, my cell phone vibrated across the granite countertop. It buzzed with a sharp, persistent rhythm. I checked the screen. The caller identification displayed Trent's name. Trent was Madison's fiancé. He was a junior executive at a regional marketing firm. He came from a modest background, but possessed a fierce ambition to climb the social ladder. He viewed his impending marriage to Madison as a strategic elevation, assuming he was marrying into deep East Coast money. He rarely called me directly, preferring to let Madison handle family communications while he focused on his golf handicap. I answered the call, keeping my tone neutral. Trent did not say hello. He sounded out of breath, as if he had been pacing a room. His voice was pitched high-tight with an anxiety I had never heard from him before. He bypassed any small talk and launched into a frantic tirade. He demanded to know why the $50,000 deposit for the rehearsal dinner had bounced. He said the catering company threatened to cancel the entire weekend contract if the funds were not wired by tomorrow morning. He yelled that he tried calling Richard, but my father was ignoring his calls. I listened to Trent panic. I told him he should probably cancel the rehearsal dinner because adults pay for their own parties. Trent cursed into the receiver. He lost his polished demeanor entirely. He screamed that he could not cancel the vendors because the wedding was the only thing keeping his future father-in-law out of a courtroom. He blurted out that if Richard did not get me to sign that quitclaim deed, the bank was going to pull the collateral and everything would collapse. The line went dead. Trent hung up, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear. I lowered the device. The air in my apartment felt suddenly electric. Trent had just handed me the final missing variable. A wedding is a cash expense. It does not require collateral unless the debt surrounding it is astronomical. My previous audit revealed severe insolvency, but Trent's slip of the tongue indicated something far more sinister. The word collateral echoed in my mind. Richard was not just trying to fund an ice sculpture. He was trying to secure a shadow loan, and he intended to use my resort to do it. The puzzle was almost complete, and I needed to uncover the exact nature of the crime my father was trying to bury. The silence in my kitchen felt heavier than before. Trent had severed the connection, but his panicked words lingered in the air. Collateral. The term bounced around my mind, demanding categorization. A wedding is a consumer expense. It requires liquid cash or standard credit lines. It does not require collateral unless the underlying debt is astronomical and the borrower is viewed as a critical risk. Trent possessed no filter and no understanding of high-level finance. He regurgitated the exact phrasing my father likely yelled at him in a moment of unguarded terror. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop. My previous digital audit uncovered severe insolvency, but insolvency alone did not explain a looming bank deadline. In forensic accounting, you learn that missing inventory always leaves a paper trail. If a man is desperate enough to pawn his mother's legacy, he is hiding a secret far worse than simple credit card debt. I needed to look beyond the public property taxes and examine the internal architecture of Richard's corporate holding company. My father served as the regional vice president of a mid-sized supply chain management firm. It was a role he secured decades ago through country club networking rather than actual merit. He possessed signatory authority over several tertiary corporate accounts. These funds were designated for warehouse maintenance, localized vendor contracts, and emergency logistics routing. I pulled the public financial filings for his firm. I then logged into a proprietary industry database I utilized for my own corporate clients, allowing me to cross-reference regional vendor payments. I began matching dates and routing numbers. The process required a surgical focus. Within 2 hours, the pattern emerged from the digital ledger. The numbers painted a portrait of a criminal enterprise. 3 years ago, Madison decided she needed a luxury loft in downtown Richmond to serve as the headquarters for her ill-fated equestrian clothing line. My parents claimed they remortgaged the colonial estate to support her dream. I examined the corporate ledger from that exact month. A wire transfer of $250,000 had been authorized by Richard. The recipient was a newly formed limited liability company listed as an independent logistics consultancy. I ran the address of that consultancy. It led to a virtual mailbox in a strip mall 3 towns over. The realization chilled my blood. I kept digging, pulling data from the past 36 months. I tracked the timeline of Victoria's sudden acquisition of a vintage diamond necklace. I matched it against a phantom invoice for dock repairs at a coastal warehouse. I tracked the month Madison began booking custom bridal fittings. That same week, my father authorized a corporate payout for emergency fleet maintenance to a company that possessed no physical address and no state operating license. Richard was not just a terrible money manager holding on to an illusion. He was actively committing interstate wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I pulled a calculator application onto my screen and ran the running total. The stolen funds exceeded $4 million. My father had spent the last 3 years systematically siphoning corporate holding funds to finance the facade of a wealthy East Coast family. The luxury vehicles, the imported orchids, the country club dues were all funded by a stolen credit line. They were living on a mountain of stolen capital. But the theft alone did not explain Trent's screaming panic regarding a pulled collateral deadline. A thief only panics when the spotlight turns on. I accessed the corporate calendar for Richard's supply chain firm. The final puzzle piece snapped into place. An independent external audit was scheduled for the end of the current fiscal year. The auditors were slated to arrive less than 3 weeks from today. The moment an independent forensic team opened those ledgers, they would spot the missing $4 million. The paper trail was sloppy. Richard would face immediate termination, federal indictment, and decades in a penitentiary. He needed to replace the stolen money before the auditors walked through the glass doors of his corporate headquarters. Traditional banking institutions do not loan $4 million to executives possessing zero liquid assets and failing credit scores. Richard had attempted to secure a standard commercial loan and was rejected. I found the corresponding hard inquiries on his credit report. Running out of options and facing federal prison. My father turned to the shadow market. He approached a ruthless private equity syndicate based out of Chicago. These unregulated lenders operate outside standard banking parameters. They approve high-risk loans in a matter of days. They do not care about credit scores or employment history. They only care about unencumbered physical assets. They demand pristine physical collateral to secure their capital. Azure Cove was the only asset left on the board. The tropical resort was worth 10 times the stolen amount and carried 0 mortgages thanks to Evelyn's meticulous management. Richard intended to use my inheritance to secure the emergency shadow loan. He planned to wire the syndicate funds into the corporate accounts, balancing the ledgers just in time to pass the annual audit. The true motive behind the relentless demand for the quitclaim deed crystallized. They did not want my home so Madison could host charity galas and post aesthetic photos. That was the palatable lie they fed to each other to maintain their pride. They desperately needed my name off that deed so they could leverage the property to avoid a federal prison sentence. I sat in the glow of my computer screen reading the digital footprints of their desperation. The syndicate, however, required more than just a forged signature on a piece of paper. Evelyn had installed a biometric security infrastructure at Azure Cove. The private equity lenders mandated an ironclad verification of possession. They required the digital master passcode and a biometric thumbprint scan to finalize the automated escrow transfer. Richard could not simply fake the documents. He needed me physically present. He needed my thumb on the glass screen of the management tablet to execute the digital contract. And he needed it fast. I looked at the timeline. The syndicate had set a hard deadline for the collateral transfer. It coincided exactly with the weekend of Madison's destination wedding. My parents were engineering a trap. They knew I would refuse to sign the quitclaim deed in the privacy of a dining room. They calculated that if they could force me to attend the wedding surrounded by 300 of Virginia's elite, they could manufacture a scenario where refusing would cause an unprecedented public scandal. They intended to use the pressure of the crowd, the presence of their wealthy peers, and the emotional manipulation of a bridal event to corner me. They assumed I would fold under the blinding spotlight of social expectation. Madison's wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a deadline to pawn my property and hide a felony. I closed my laptop and pushed my chair back from the desk. The room was quiet, but my pulse hummed with a cold, steady rhythm. I was no longer dealing with a toxic family dispute. I was navigating a criminal conspiracy. My father was a federal felon. My mother was a willing accomplice. My sister was a spoiled beneficiary blind to the rot beneath her feet. They had traded my graduation dinner for an ice sculpture because they viewed me as free labor. Now they were trading my inheritance to buy their freedom. I walked over to the window and looked out at the streetlights below. I knew their next tactical maneuver. If they needed me physically present at the resort, they had to legitimize their presence there first. They could not risk me shutting down the venue before the guests arrived. They were going to attempt a hostile takeover by proxy. They would try to force my hand by making the event public, making it impossible to cancel without creating a spectacle. I waited for the mail to arrive the next morning, expecting the golden embossed envelope. I was ready to receive my invitation to a heist. The heavy ivory envelope arrived in my mailbox on a standard Thursday afternoon. It did not resemble typical mail. It possessed the weight of a bound manuscript and bore a wax seal stamped with my sister's future married initials. I carried it upstairs to my apartment and broke the seal with a kitchen knife. Inside rested a piece of thick, customized cardstock bordered in genuine gold foil. The calligraphy was sharp and elegant, spelling out a formal summons to the social event of the decade. Madison and Trent were formally announcing their impending nuptials. I scanned the flowing script until my eyes locked onto the location details printed near the bottom of the card. The venue listed for the entire 3-day extravagant destination wedding was Azure Cove. The sheer delusion radiating from that piece of paper was breathtaking. My parents were officially locked out of the resort's internal management system. They possessed zero administrative clearance to book a single room, let alone reserve the entire private peninsula. Yet they had paid hundreds of dollars per envelope to mail these summons to 300 of the most elite families in Virginia. They were actively broadcasting a lie to state senators, corporate executives, and local philanthropists. I set the invitation down on my granite countertop and analyzed the logistics of their maneuver. In the corporate sector, this tactic is known as a hostile takeover by proxy. When a failing executive cannot legally seize an asset, they utilize external pressure to force a surrender. Richard and Victoria knew they could not break through the biometric security gates of the Florida resort. They calculated that if they chartered flights, booked off-site vendors on credit, and arrived at the main gate with 300 wealthy, influential guests in tow, I would face an impossible dilemma. They weaponized my lifelong conditioning as the reliable scapegoat. For my entire life, I had served as the invisible shock absorber for their chaotic decisions. They assumed my innate desire to avoid public embarrassment would override my legal ownership. They hypothesized that if a fleet of limousines stacked up outside the gates of Azure Cove, I would fold under the crushing weight of public shame. They believed I would rather hand over the security overrides than watch 300 high society Virginians be turned away by local law enforcement in the sweltering Florida heat. They were treating my multi-million-dollar inheritance as a temporary clerical error that they could correct through sheer social brute force. To understand Victoria's reliance on this specific brand of warfare, you have to look at her history of social engineering. When I was 17, my mother decided she wanted to host a charity gala at the most exclusive country club in Richmond. The venue was already booked months in advance by a rival philanthropic board. Victoria did not accept the rejection. She hired a boutique printing press, drafted unauthorized invitations, and mailed them to every major donor in the city. The country club manager faced a nightmare scenario. Turning away the wealthiest donors in the state would generate terrible press and ruin the club's pristine reputation. The manager caved, canceled the original booking, and allowed Victoria to commandeer the ballroom. She learned early on that forcing a fait accompli was highly effective against people who feared bad optics. Now she was running the exact same playbook on her own daughter. I looked at the gold foil invitation resting on my counter. The lingering traces of childhood sadness evaporated. The dull ache of being an overlooked daughter burned away, leaving behind a sharp, clinical fury. My parents were no longer just stealing my graduation dinner or demanding free labor. They were actively jeopardizing the commercial integrity of my business. A standoff at the front gates involving local police and stranded billionaires would generate catastrophic headlines for a five-star luxury hospitality brand. I realized I could not simply ignore the invitation. Silence would allow them to dictate the terms of the engagement. I had to respond in a way that would irrevocably alter the rules of their game. I opened my laptop and accessed the Azure Cove administrative dashboard. I reviewed the upcoming occupancy metrics. The resort was currently operating at low capacity due to the impending hurricane season. The sprawling network of private oceanfront villas sat mostly vacant. I made a calculated executive decision. I would not lock the gates. I would open them. A trap only functions if the prey feels secure enough to step inside. If I barred their entry, they would retreat to Virginia and spin a narrative of victimhood claiming I ruined a sacred family milestone. They would continue to leverage their shadow debt and harass me from afar. I needed to eradicate their leverage permanently. I needed them to walk into the venue surrounded by the very audience they intended to use against me. I would allow them to set up their imported floral arrangements and their celebrity disc jockey. I would let them construct their elaborate house of cards on my property. I walked into my bedroom and pulled my hard-shell suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I was not packing for a family vacation. I was preparing for a rapid extraction of their remaining dignity. I bypassed my formal evening wear and packed my tailored business suits. I gathered my encrypted hard drives containing the forensic audit of Richard's corporate embezzlement. I printed physical copies of the shadow loan affidavits and the specific stipulations of Evelyn's blind trust. I placed the documents into a secure leather portfolio. I was bringing the raw, undeniable data to a venue built on lies. As I folded my clothes, my mind traced the remaining timeline. The destination wedding was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. My parents were likely flying down to the Keys in a few days to coordinate the external vendors they had hired on phantom credit. But Richard still faced a critical operational hurdle. Occupying the resort was not enough to satisfy his private equity syndicate. The shadow lenders required the biometric verification of possession to execute the escrow transfer. Richard needed my physical thumbprint on a management tablet to finalize the multi-million-dollar loan before the independent corporate auditors arrived at his firm. He could not wait until the wedding reception to secure the signature. He needed the collateral locked down beforehand. I knew they would attempt one final localized ambush to extort the biometric code before I left the state. They needed to apply maximum pressure in a controlled environment where they held the territorial advantage. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, interrupting my packing. The screen displayed a calendar alert. It was a formal summons from Victoria sent via a shared family application I rarely checked. She was requesting my presence at the local Richmond Country Club the following afternoon for an intimate pre-wedding bridal luncheon. The event description claimed it was a final gathering of the bridal party to finalize travel logistics. I stared at the digital notification. The hostility was evolving into a direct confrontation. Victoria knew my flight was booked. She knew her window of opportunity to secure the deed in Virginia was rapidly closing. She selected the country club because it was her primary stronghold. It was a space saturated with her influential peers and wealthy allies. She intended to isolate me in her own territory and extract the required signature before I ever set foot in Florida. I accepted the calendar invitation, closed my suitcase, and prepared to face the architect of the smear campaign on her own polished marble floors. I pulled my car into the valet lane of the Richmond Country Club. The building stood as a monument to exclusivity and engineered perception. The towering white pillars and sweeping golf courses were designed to separate the elite from the ordinary. For my mother, the club was a primary stronghold. It was a space saturated with her influential peers and wealthy allies. I handed my keys to a young attendant and walked through the mahogany front doors. I navigated the familiar hallways toward the private dining rooms. I knew Victoria had selected this venue to isolate me on her own territory. She intended to extract the required signature before I ever set foot in Florida. I entered the sunlit parlor reserved for the pre-wedding bridal luncheon. The room was a symphony of pastel dresses and clinking mimosa glasses. Madison sat at the center of a long table draped in ivory linen, acting like royalty holding court. She laughed too loud and flashed her diamond ring at a circle of eager bridesmaids. Victoria orchestrated the room with the precision of a stage director. She darted between guests offering bright smiles and pouring champagne. She performed the role of the joyous matriarch perfectly. I took a seat near the edge of the gathering and observed the theater. In my profession, examining a fraudulent ledger requires patience. You do not interrupt the flow of false data. You let the numbers present themselves until the underlying error becomes obvious. I applied the same logic to my family. I drank sparkling water and watched Victoria cast nervous glances in my direction. Her bright smile never reached her eyes. The tension in her shoulders betrayed the ticking clock in her mind. She knew the private equity syndicate was waiting for the collateral transfer. She knew her husband was facing a federal audit. She needed me alone. After 40 minutes of enduring the synthetic joy of the luncheon, I provided her the opportunity. I excused myself from the table and walked down the carpeted corridor toward the women's powder room. The country club powder room was a lavish space. It featured floor-to-ceiling mirrors, green marble countertops, and polished brass fixtures. Soft, ambient music played through hidden speakers, masking the noise of the dining rooms outside. I walked over to the sink and turned the brass handle. The cold water ran over my hands. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, preparing to head back out to the luncheon and make a quiet exit. The heavy wooden door behind me swung shut. The brass deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp metallic sound. The ambient music seemed to fade into the background. I looked into the mirror and saw Victoria standing directly behind me. The performative smile was gone. The elegant Virginia matriarch had vanished. In her place stood a cornered, desperate predator. Her facial muscles were tight. The skin around her eyes looked strained under her expensive makeup. She stepped closer to me. The scent of her heavy floral perfume filled the confined space. She did not yell, because yelling would attract attention from the hallway. She spoke in a low, rapid whisper that cut through the quiet hum of the bathroom. She told me the games were officially over. She said my stubborn refusal to cooperate was ending today. She opened her designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She dropped it onto the marble counter right next to the sink. The heavy paper slapped against the stone, echoing in the room. Victoria tapped the cover of the folder with a manicured fingernail. She delivered her ultimatum with chilling precision. She claimed she had hired a private investigator to compile a comprehensive dossier on my accounting career. She stated that the folder contained highly convincing evidence proving I had been embezzling funds from my own corporate clients. She explained the mechanics of her blackmail. She said the fabricated dossier contained forged vendor contracts. It contained doctored emails and manipulated tax returns. She claimed she paid a professional graphic designer to duplicate my electronic signature onto illegal financial documents. She looked me dead in the eye and promised to leak the dossier directly to the board of directors at my accounting firm on Monday morning. The threat hung in the humid air of the powder room. I stared at the manila folder. The psychological projection was breathtaking. My mother was actively shielding a husband who had stolen $4 million using phantom vendors and fake accounts. Now she was threatening to frame her own daughter for the exact same crime. She was utilizing the blueprint of Richard's felony to blackmail me. She thought the symmetry was clever. She did not realize the symmetry was a confession. To understand Victoria's reliance on this tactic, you must examine how she resolves conflict. Whenever she faces an obstacle, she invents a scandal to remove it. When a local charity board president once voted against her fundraising proposal, Victoria started a rumor that the president was stealing from the donation pool. The president resigned within a month. Victoria believed that reputation destruction was the ultimate weapon. She assumed that because I built my life on my career, I would surrender my property to protect my name. She leaned in close, her voice dripping with venom. She told me I had until the cocktail hour at the wedding reception to transfer the deed to Azure Cove. She demanded the digital master passcode and a notarized quitclaim deed. She informed me she had a private courier standing by in Florida. The courier was instructed to take the documents straight to a shadow registrar to finalize the collateral transfer before the weekend concluded. She promised to leave me unhirable, homeless, and dead to my industry if I refused to sign. Victoria waited for my reaction. She expected my armor to crack. She expected me to panic or cry or plead for my professional life. She thought the threat of poverty and social ruin would force me to pull out my phone and punch the security overrides into her hand right then and there. She did not understand the person standing in front of her. In the financial sector, when a competitor attempts a hostile takeover using leverage, you do not negotiate. You recognize their leverage is built on a bluff, and you walk away. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my innocence. Arguing would validate her delusion. I reached across the counter and pulled a fresh linen towel from the brass basket. I dried my hands methodically. I wiped the moisture from each finger, taking my time. Victoria watched me, her breathing shallow and erratic. She was confused by my silence. I folded the damp towel and placed it gently into the discard tray. I turned back to her. I looked deep into her frantic, bloodshot eyes. I let her see that I felt no fear. I let her see that her threats meant nothing to a woman who already knew the truth about her stolen empire. A fabricated dossier would unravel the moment my firm ran a genuine forensic audit. Furthermore, if she leaked the documents, she would invite federal scrutiny into her own household right before Richard's audit began. It was a suicide mission, and we both knew she lacked the courage to pull the trigger. I did not say a single word. I stepped around her, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and walked out into the hallway. I did not return to the sunlit parlor. I did not need to see the rest of the charade. The intelligence gathering phase was over. I had confirmed their desperation and their timeline. I walked straight out of the country club and handed my valet ticket to the attendant. I stepped into my car and drove away from the rolling green hills of the golf course. The final deadline was established. My family wanted a spectacular wedding reception at a premier tropical resort. They intended to use the venue to trap me and extort my inheritance. I drove toward my apartment to collect my hard-shell suitcase. My flight to the Florida Keys departed in 4 hours. I was heading into their intended battleground, but I was arriving on my own terms. The quiet threats in Virginia were finished. The conflict was moving to Azure Cove, and the destination wedding was about to begin. I boarded a commercial flight to South Florida just 4 hours after walking out of the Richmond Country Club powder room. I did not check any luggage, preferring the efficiency of a single hard-shell carry on containing my encrypted ledgers and tailored suits. Leaving the claustrophobic airspace of Virginia felt like shedding a heavy winter coat. When the plane descended over the crystalline waters of the Florida Keys, the sensory shift was jarring. The humid, stagnant tension of my parents' colonial estate was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of salt air and ocean breeze. I rented a subtle sedan and drove down the overseas highway toward the private peninsula that held my inheritance. I had only seen Azure Cove once as a teenager, but the reality of the property dwarfed my memory. The resort was a sprawling sanctuary of modern architecture nestled into dense tropical foliage. The main pavilion featured soaring ceilings crafted from polished teak and walls of reinforced glass that offered an unbroken view of the Atlantic horizon. Evelyn built this sanctuary to cater to people who demanded privacy and possessed the capital to enforce it. I parked my vehicle and walked through the mahogany front doors, not as a curious guest, but as the sole managing director arriving to defend her territory. I bypassed the pristine reception desk and navigated straight to the executive offices located behind a discreet frosted glass door. Marcus, the security director I had spoken with on the phone, was already waiting for me in the primary boardroom. He stood tall and unsmiling, a man whose posture spoke of years spent mitigating high-risk threats for private military firms. Sitting across from him was Mr. Thorne, the resort's resident legal counsel. Thorne was a pragmatic veteran of corporate law who had orchestrated Evelyn's most ruthless land acquisitions during the late 90s. He possessed a mind for loopholes and a deep disdain for frivolous litigation. I took my seat at the head of the polished obsidian table. I did not waste time exchanging pleasantries or discussing my grandmother's recent passing. I approached the situation like a forensic audit, opening my leather portfolio and extracting the printed evidence. I laid out the shadow loan affidavits, the corporate embezzlement timelines, and the forged vendor contracts my mother threatened to use against me. I explained that my family was descending upon the peninsula in less than 48 hours, intending to use the venue to secure a fraudulent multi-million-dollar credit line. Thorne reviewed the documents, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He recognized the legal jeopardy immediately. If Richard managed to execute the collateral transfer on the premises, the resort would be entangled in a federal asset forfeiture case for years. Thorne agreed that a proactive defensive posture was the only viable option. I turned to Marcus and authorized a total system overhaul. We spent the next 2 hours recalibrating the security infrastructure. Azure Cove operated on a closed-loop digital network. Marcus systematically purged all legacy administrative passcodes and generated new cryptographic keys. We physically walked to the primary server room and reinforced the biometric access points. The scanners governing the executive suites, the financial offices, and the main gates were wiped clean. I placed my thumb against the primary sensor, registering my print as the solitary master key. The digital fortress was now sealed off from any external override attempts. Richard could scream at the staff or brandish fake deeds, but without my physical thumbprint, the electronic infrastructure would treat him like a stranger on the street. Securing the digital perimeter was only the first phase of the operation. The human element required a delicate touch. I summoned the department heads to the boardroom, including David, the general manager, and Elena, the director of guest services. They entered the room carrying clipboards and nervous expressions. They were accustomed to running a flawless hospitality machine, and the sudden influx of chaotic, unauthorized demands from Madison had rattled their equilibrium. I asked them to take a seat, and I projected a calm, unwavering authority. I informed the staff that a large-scale, unauthorized event was arriving at our gates by the end of the week. I saw the panic flash in David's eyes as he mentally calculated the logistical nightmare of rejecting 300 angry socialites. I raised my hand to stop his impending objections. I delivered a directive that defied standard hospitality protocols. I told them we were not going to lock the gates. We were going to open them and play along. I instructed the front desk to allow my parents and their guests to check into the oceanfront villas. I told Elena to greet the off-site wedding planners and grant them access to the grand terrace. When the external caterers arrived with the imported white peonies and the crystal centerpieces, the staff was to direct them to the loading docks without hesitation. I laid out one strict boundary. The staff was to provide standard polite service, but they were forbidden from signing any invoices confirming any contractual agreements or granting my family access to the administrative offices. My parents were to be treated like standard tourists, possessing zero operational authority. David looked confused, asking why we would permit a hostile occupation of our own venue. I explained the psychology of the trap. You never interrupt an adversary who is in the process of making a catastrophic miscalculation. By allowing Richard and Victoria to occupy the resort and run up exorbitant tabs with local vendors on phantom credit, they were committing further fraud on my soil. They were building their elaborate house of cards on a table I owned. I wanted them to dig the hole exactly as deep as they needed it to be. Once they assembled their entire social network inside the trap, the subsequent collapse would be inescapable. The department heads nodded slowly, understanding the tactical advantage of the ruse. They returned to their posts, ready to execute the illusion. With the staff briefed and the perimeter secured, I retreated to the owner's suite located on the top floor of the main pavilion. Evelyn designed the space as a panoramic observation deck. The suite featured wraparound impact glass, offering a 360-degree view of the peninsula. The floors were crafted from dark mahogany, and the furnishings were sparse and functional. It was the perfect vantage point to oversee an impending invasion. I converted the teak dining table into a command center. I set up my dual laptops, linking them directly to Marcus and the resort's closed-circuit security feeds. A grid of high-definition camera angles populated my screens displaying the main entrance, the marina, the grand terrace, and the lobby. I poured a glass of cold water and sat in the ergonomic chair watching the monitors hum with silent activity. The isolation of the owner's suite provided a profound sense of insulation. I was no longer a vulnerable target standing in a country club powder room. I was the architect holding the blueprints to their destruction. I spent the next 2 days monitoring the incoming flights and the vendor deliveries. I watched a fleet of delivery trucks roll through the security gates, carrying velvet chairs, lighting rigs, and thousands of imported flowers. The tension mounted with every truck that cleared the checkpoint. The board was officially set. The Virginia elite were packing their bags and boarding their chartered flights, oblivious to the reality awaiting them. I sat in my $3 million fortress, watching the monitors and waiting for my family to walk through the front door. The monitors in the command center flickered to life. A line of sleek black sedans rolled over the private causeway connecting the peninsula to the mainland. The Virginia high society had arrived. They descended upon the Florida property like a swarm of locusts dressed in designer resort wear. I stood on the balcony of the owner's suite, looking down at the pristine cobblestone driveway. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt water and the distinct metallic tang of impending ruin. Richard was the first to emerge from the lead vehicle. The physical toll of his hidden crimes was glaringly obvious from my elevated vantage point. He did not look like the triumphant patriarch preparing to give his youngest daughter away in a spectacular ceremony. He looked pallid and slick with a cold sweat despite the robust air conditioning of the luxury car. He stood by the open door, ignoring the valet attendants, and stared obsessively at his cellular phone. I knew exactly what held his attention. The Chicago private equity syndicate was likely sending automated alerts regarding the escrow portal. The shadow lender required biometric verification of the deed before releasing the $4 million. Every time his screen illuminated, Richard's shoulders hitched with raw anxiety. He was a man standing on a trapdoor waiting for a digital execution. Victoria exited the vehicle next and immediately launched into a theatrical performance of dominance. She darted through the sliding glass doors of the grand lobby and began barking rapid-fire orders at the concierge desk. She pointed her manicured fingers at the brass luggage carts demanding immediate transport to the premier oceanfront villas. To the untrained eye, she projected the image of a victorious, wealthy matriarch firmly in control of her domain. But forensic analysis requires looking past the surface presentation to study the micro-expressions. Her movements were sharp, erratic, and fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. She was overcompensating because she knew her entire life was a fragile mirage. One missed signature separated her from a federal indictment and the loss of everything she worshipped. Madison and Trent followed close behind, leaving the driver to handle their excessive baggage. They strutted across the polished marble floors of the reception area, treating the venue as their personal kingdom. Madison wore a white silk jumpsuit and oversized sunglasses, demanding trays of imported champagne the moment she crossed the threshold. Trent trailed her carrying a garment bag and acting the part of the successful junior executive. They dismissed the polite greeting from David, the general manager, without a second glance. They treated my highly trained hospitality staff like invisible furniture. Growing up, Victoria taught Madison that service workers were simply background characters in the movie of her life. If a waiter brought the wrong order, Victoria would loudly demand a manager to teach Madison how to assert her status. My sister internalized that lesson perfectly. She snapped her fingers at a bellhop, directing him toward her designer luggage with a flippant wave of her hand. I watched the interaction on the security feed, feeling a deep, profound satisfaction, knowing the staff had strict orders to play along while denying any actual administrative authority to my family. I turned away from the monitors and smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. It was time to descend from the isolation of the owner's suite and establish my physical presence on the board. I left the executive wing and walked toward the grand staircase that overlooked the main lobby. The architecture of Azure Cove was designed to inspire awe. The sweeping staircase curved down toward the reception floor, offering a commanding view of the arriving guests. As I descended the teak steps, the ambient noise of the lobby seemed to amplify. The chatter of the Virginia elite, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the frantic commands from my mother created a symphony of stolen wealth. Madison was the first to spot me. She paused midway through a sip of champagne and lowered her glass. A smug, self-satisfied smirk spread across her face. Trent noticed her gaze and followed it, turning to look up at the staircase. He puffed out his chest, standing a little taller. They truly believed they had won. They looked at me and saw a defeated woman who had folded under the crushing weight of public shame. They assumed the threat Victoria delivered in the country club powder room had broken my spine. They thought the fabricated dossier and the promise of professional ruin had brought me to my knees. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stood on the marble floor. I did not glare at my sister. I did not cause a scene or project any hostility. I offered a polite, flat smile. It was the exact expression an auditor utilizes when examining a terminal account right before presenting the final notice of bankruptcy. I blended seamlessly into the background, stepping near a cluster of indoor palm trees. I observed their desperate performance with total clinical detachment. They were consuming the evidence of their own destruction in real time. The vintage champagne Madison drank was procured on phantom credit. The velvet chairs being unloaded by the external vendors were financed by interstate wire fraud. Every laugh, every boast, every toast was another brick in the federal case building against them. Richard finally pocketed his phone and walked into the lobby. His eyes darted around the room until they locked onto me. He did not greet the wealthy guests swirling around him. He marched directly toward my position near the foliage. His gait was stiff and unnatural. He stopped 2 feet away, invading my personal space in an attempt to silently assert dominance. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and unwashed fear. He spoke in a low, gravelly whisper that vibrated with panic. He instructed me to meet him in the private dining room adjacent to the grand terrace at 6 o'clock sharp. He stated that the digital tablet was prepped and the courier was waiting on standby. He told me we were going to finalize the paperwork before the welcome dinner commenced, and if I caused any delays, Victoria would hit send on the email to my corporate board. I looked at the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I noted the slight tremor in his hands. He was trying to sound like a commanding titan of industry, but he sounded like a cornered debtor begging for a lifeline. I gave him a single curt nod. I told him I would be there. Richard exhaled a shaky breath, believing he had secured my compliance. He turned around and walked toward the lobby bar to order a double scotch. He thought he had outmaneuvered me. He thought the shadow loan was safe and the corporate audit would be thwarted. I watched him walk away, my pulse steady and calm. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The Virginia elite were unpacking their bags in my private villas. The vendors were setting up the elaborate rehearsal dinner on the grand terrace. The syndicate deadline was ticking down to midnight. Richard assumed the meeting at 6 o'clock would be a quiet surrender in a private room out of sight from his peers. He did not realize I had zero intention of signing a digital tablet in the shadows. The confrontation was not going to be a secret negotiation. It was going to be the main event. The trap was fully loaded, and the tension was about to explode into the public square. The evening air settled over the Florida Keys, carrying the scent of salt water and blooming jasmine. The grand terrace of Azure Cove was transformed into a theater of staggering, superficial opulence. String quartets played soft classical arrangements in the corners of the sprawling stone patio. Thousands of imported white peonies spilled from towering crystal vases, catching the ambient glow of the string lights suspended above. 300 of the most influential citizens of Virginia sat at round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. They were sipping vintage Bordeaux and eating plates of seared scallops. They laughed and exchanged industry gossip, oblivious to the reality beneath their feet. They were participating in the celebration of a federal crime. I sat at a secondary table near the edge of the terrace, maintaining a clear sightline to the main stage. My parents had deliberately positioned me away from the head table to isolate me from the primary guest of honor. It was a strategic demotion designed to make me feel small. They assumed the physical distance would heighten my anxiety. Instead, the vantage point provided me with the perfect angle to observe the crumbling architecture of their conspiracy. At the head table, Richard was deteriorating in plain sight. The ambient temperature was mild, but a sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the glare of the stage lights. He barely touched his catered meal. He drank his wine in rapid, nervous gulps, while his eyes darted continuously toward his wristwatch. The midnight deadline set by the Chicago private equity syndicate was rapidly approaching. The shadowlenders required the unencumbered deed to release the $4 million necessary to cover his corporate embezzlement. Without the biometric transfer, Richard was staring at the imminent arrival of independent auditors and a guaranteed federal indictment. Victoria sat beside him, projecting the image of a radiant, wealthy matriarch. She dazzled the state senators and corporate executives seated nearby, flashing her practiced smile and touching their arms with feigned intimacy. Yet beneath the table, her hands were clenched into tight fists. She was operating on pure adrenaline and unfiltered terror. Her entire social standing, her colonial estate, her freedom rested on the digital signature she intended to extort from me before the night ended. Madison and Trent occupied the center of the head table, soaking in the admiration of the crowd. Madison wore a custom silk evening gown that draped elegantly over her frame, paid for by stolen logistics funds. She leaned into Trent, whispering and laughing, believing she was the undisputed queen of the peninsula. She had no idea her parents were utilizing her milestone event as a shield for a felony. The catering staff cleared the final dinner plates and poured fresh champagne for the upcoming toasts. The string quartet faded into a quiet pause. The ambient chatter of the 300 guests slowly lowered to a hushed murmur. Richard pushed his chair back from the table. The scrape of the wooden legs against the stone terrace echoed in the quiet night. He stood up and tapped his crystal goblet with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound commanded the attention of the crowd. He buttoned his tailored tuxedo jacket and walked toward the center of the raised stage. He grabbed the microphone from the stand and looked out over the sea of faces. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the panic clawing at his throat, but he masked it with the practiced cadence of a corporate manager. He delivered a hollow speech about the enduring legacy of the Butler family. He spoke about the importance of building a strong foundation for the next generation. The hypocrisy of his words hung heavy in the humid air. He was a man who had hollowed out his own mother's empire and looted his employer's accounts, lecturing a crowd about foundations. Richard pivoted his speech toward Madison. He praised her grace, her creative vision, and her supposed entrepreneurial spirit. He painted her as the shining future of their lineage. Madison beamed from her seat, dabbing her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the overwhelmed bride. The audience offered a warm, polite round of applause. Then the trap was sprung. Richard lowered his voice, adopting a tone of deep, sentimental reverence. He told the crowd that a strong family is built on sacrifice and shared prosperity. He spun a fabricated narrative about the unbreakable bond between his two daughters. He announced that tonight the Butler family was going to demonstrate the true meaning of generosity. He looked past the crystal centerpieces and locked eyes with me. He called my name over the sound system. He announced to the Virginia elite that I had prepared a special surprise for the bride and groom. He demanded I join him up on the stage to present Madison with the ultimate wedding gift. The spotlight operator swept a beam of bright white light across the terrace, illuminating my table. 300 pairs of eyes shifted in unison, pinning me under their collective gaze. The social mechanics of the ambush were flawless. Richard knew I despised public spectacles. He calculated that refusing to stand up and join him would brand me as a bitter, jealous sister in front of every corporate client and high society peer in the room. He was weaponizing the expectation of the crowd to force my compliance. I did not hesitate. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my navy evening gown. I kept my expression entirely neutral, displaying the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant entering a hostile boardroom. I walked down the center aisle of the terrace, navigating between the tables of staring guests. I felt the weight of their judgment, but it did not slow my pace. I ascended the short flight of stairs and stepped onto the wooden platform of the stage. Richard stepped back, offering a tight, strained smile. He gestured toward the wings of the stage. A waiter emerged from the shadows wearing a crisp white uniform. He walked forward carrying a polished silver platter. Resting in the center of the tray was not a velvet jewelry box or a ceremonial key. It was a secure digital management tablet. I recognized the glowing interface immediately. It was the biometric administrative portal linked directly to the Chicago Syndicate's automated escrow system. The screen displayed a blank authorization field, waiting for the master cryptographic signature. It was the instrument of my surrender. Victoria materialized beside me, stepping out from the shadows of the head table. She wrapped her arm around my waist in what appeared to the audience as a loving maternal embrace. The crowd let out a collective sigh of admiration at the beautiful family tableau. The reality was far more sinister. Victoria gripped my side with the force of a vice. Her manicured nails dug sharply into my ribs through the thin fabric of my dress. She leaned her head against my shoulder, turning her face away from the audience to conceal her moving lips. Her voice was a ragged, desperate whisper vibrating with raw panic. She told me the courier was waiting in the lobby to confirm the transfer. She commanded me to punch in my biometric code right now. She reminded me of the fabricated dossier sitting in her designer handbag. She threatened to leak the forged vendor contracts to my firm on Monday morning. She promised to destroy my career, strip me of my income, and leave me with nothing if I did not press my thumb to that glass screen. The waiter held the silver platter out, offering the glowing tablet. The audience began to cheer, clapping in anticipation of the heartwarming climax of the evening. The Las Vegas music producer, stationed near the bar, triggered a low, dramatic musical swell to underscore the moment. The pressure in the air was thick enough to suffocate. 300 people expected me to sign away my inheritance to buy my sister's happiness. My parents expected the threat of professional ruin to force my hand. They needed my thumbprint to execute the multi-million-dollar shadow loan and cover their federal crimes. I looked down at the digital interface glowing on the silver tray. The escrow portal waited for the biometric verification. I looked at Victoria, feeling her nails piercing my skin. I looked at Richard, watching the sweat drip down his pale face. Finally, I looked out at the sea of expectant faces clapping and smiling in the dark tropical night. My parents assumed I evaluated the risk and decided my accounting career was worth more than Evelyn's property. They applied the logic of a blackmailer, expecting me to fold under the bright lights of social expectation. I raised my right hand toward the silver platter. Victoria exhaled a sharp breath of relief against my shoulder, thinking she had won. The waiter leaned forward slightly, tilting the tray to accommodate my hand. I did not press my thumb to the glass screen. I reached past the silver platter, bypassing the tablet entirely. I extended my arm and wrapped my fingers around the cold, rigid metal of the microphone resting on the microphone stand. I pulled the device from its cradle. The sudden movement generated a low electronic hum through the speakers, cutting through the polite applause. The cheering faltered and died away. The music producer quickly faded out the underlying beat, sensing a shift in the planned schedule. A heavy, expectant silence rushed in to fill the sprawling terrace. I stood in the center of the stage, holding the microphone, looking down at the architects of my destruction. I pulled the microphone from the stand, bringing the metal grill to my lips. The feedback generated a sharp electronic whine that silenced the remaining whispers on the grand terrace. 300 guests turned their collective attention toward the stage. I looked at the sea of expectant faces, the state senators, the regional logistics executives, and the country club elite. Then I turned my head to look directly at my father. "The resort belongs to Grandmother Evelyn's trust in me," I announced. My voice carried across the stone patio, echoing off the teak walls of the main pavilion. "It is not mine to give, and it is certainly not yours to steal." The vacuum of sound that followed was deafening. The waiter holding the silver platter took a slow, terrified step backward, his eyes darting between me and the digital tablet. Victoria dropped her arm from my waist, as if the fabric of my dress had suddenly caught fire. The performative maternal warmth dissolved instantly. She stumbled back, her designer heels scraping against the wooden stage floor. Richard stood frozen, his jaw slack, the color draining from his face until his skin resembled wet ash. I did not give them a moment to recover or spin a counter-narrative. I reached into the hidden interior pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a thick, folded stack of documents. These were not props or aesthetic boards. They were the raw, undeniable data of a forensic audit. I held the papers up under the blinding stage lights. I addressed the crowd utilizing the clinical, precise language of the financial sector. I knew my audience. These were individuals who served on corporate boards and managed multi-million-dollar portfolios. They understood the gravity of an unbalanced ledger. I informed the guests that the event they were attending was not a celebration of a young couple's future. It was an active crime scene designed to cover up a staggering corporate theft. I looked down at the head table where Madison sat paralyzed in her custom silk gown. I explained the specific mechanics of Richard's insolvency. I detailed how my father had spent the last 36 months siphoning funds from his supply chain management firm. I listed the phantom vendor accounts, the fake logistics invoices, and the offshore shell companies he created to fund his daughter's equestrian clothing line and his wife's diamond jewelry. I stated the final calculated deficit, $4 million. A low, unified gasp rippled through the seated audience. Several high-profile executives pushed their chairs back, instinctively distancing themselves from the head table. I watched a prominent Virginia judge set his wineglass down with a trembling hand. I pointed to the elaborate floral arrangements cascading down the centerpieces. I gestured toward the plates of seared scallops and the crystal flutes filled with vintage Bordeaux. I told the crowd that every single item on this terrace was financed by interstate wire fraud. The opulence they were admiring was the direct result of embezzlement. They were unwittingly participating in the laundering of stolen corporate capital. Victoria attempted to interrupt. She scrambled toward the microphone, her face contorted with panic. She yelled that I was a liar. She shrieked about the private investigator she hired and the dossier sitting in her handbag. She threatened to expose my supposed accounting crimes to the very executives sitting in the audience. I did not back away. I leaned into the microphone and preempted her blackmail. I told the crowd that my mother was currently carrying a folder of forged contracts and doctored tax returns. I explained that she had cornered me in a country club powder room and threatened to frame me for her husband's exact crimes if I did not surrender the deed to Azure Cove. I invited any executive in the room to order an independent audit of my client files on Monday morning. My ledgers were pristine. Her threat was a hollow, desperate bluff from a woman staring at a federal prison sentence. Victoria stopped moving. She looked at the faces of her peers. The women she had manipulated at charity luncheons were staring back at her with undisguised revulsion. The social empire she spent decades cultivating burned to the ground in a matter of seconds. She realized the elite circles of Virginia do not forgive poverty, and they certainly do not associate with federal felons. The focus of the devastation then shifted to the center of the head table. Trent stood up. His chair tipped backward and clattered against the stone tiles. Trent was an ambitious junior marketing executive who viewed his relationship with Madison as a strategic social elevation. He grew up in a modest suburban neighborhood and tolerated Madison's endless tantrums because he firmly believed he was marrying into deep East Coast generational wealth. He endured the chaotic bridal planning, assuming a golden parachute was waiting at the altar. Trent did the math. He looked at Richard and Victoria. He recognized that the colonial estate, the luxury vehicles, and the country club memberships were mirages built on stolen money. He looked at Madison, who was weeping into her hands, her carefully applied makeup running down her face. She was not a wealthy heiress. She was an unemployed liability with an insatiable appetite for designer goods and zero underlying assets. More importantly, Trent understood the legal jeopardy of his current position. Tying his name to a family facing an imminent federal indictment would obliterate his own budding career. Corporate marketing firms do not promote executives embroiled in wire fraud scandals. He turned toward Madison. He did not offer a comforting embrace. His face was a mask of furious betrayal. He reached down and grabbed her left hand. He pulled the custom engagement ring off her finger. The stone was purchased with stolen logistics funds, making it a piece of criminal evidence. Trent threw the ring onto the floor. The heavy platinum band hit the stone terrace with a sharp, metallic clink and rolled under a nearby table. He did not say a single word. He turned his back on the weeping bride and stormed off the terrace, marching toward the main lobby to call a taxi. Madison let out a loud, ragged sob. The golden child was finally forced to confront a reality that could not be fixed with a credit card or a parental bribe. Her fiancé had abandoned her. Her high society friends were watching her humiliation. The illusion of her superiority was shattered. I turned my attention back to my father. Richard was leaning against the edge of the stage, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. He was staring at the digital tablet resting on the waiter's silver platter. The screen displayed the automated escrow portal linked to the Chicago private equity syndicate. I checked the sleek silver watch on my left wrist. The hands aligned perfectly. The time was exactly midnight. The syndicate had issued a hard operational deadline. They required the biometric verification of possession by midnight to authorize the $4 million shadow loan. Without my thumbprint, the electronic contract remained unfulfilled. A sharp digital chime echoed from the tablet. The screen flashed a bright red rejection notice. The automated escrow system timed out. The portal closed, and the pending credit line was instantly voided. The syndicate had officially pulled the collateral request. The lifeline was severed. The raw, visceral terror set into my father's eyes. The color of his face shifted from pale to a dangerous purple hue. He knew what the red screen meant. The funds would not be wired into his corporate holding accounts. The $4 million deficit remained wide open. In less than 48 hours, the independent auditors would arrive at his Virginia headquarters. They would open the ledgers, find the empty accounts, and notify the federal authorities. There was no escape route left. Richard collapsed. His knees buckled and he sank into a velvet chair near the edge of the stage. He buried his face in his trembling hands. Victoria fell to her knees beside him, ruining her designer gown on the stone patio. She sobbed uncontrollably, mourning the death of her status and the impending loss of her freedom. I stood on the stage looking down at the wreckage. The retaliation was complete. I had not laid a hand on them. I simply presented the unvarnished truth and allowed their own criminal negligence to execute the final judgment. The destination wedding had transformed into a financial graveyard. The guests began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing the swift and brutal nature of the justice they had just witnessed. The stage was set for the final reckoning, and I held the only remaining key to the exits. The departure of the high society guests acted as a swift, brutal current. State senators and corporate vice presidents survive on public perception. Being photographed drinking champagne at an event funded by a federal felony is career suicide. The exodus began as a quiet scramble and rapidly escalated into a stampede of high society panic. Chairs scraped harshly against the stone tiles. Silk wraps were snatched off the backs of seats. The regional logistics executives who had previously questioned my moral character practically sprinted toward the valet stand. They recognized the lethal accuracy of my forensic audit and wanted no part of the impending federal inquiry. Within 10 minutes, the grand terrace of Azure Cove transformed into a graveyard of abandoned centerpieces and half-empty wine glasses. Waiters stood frozen against the teak walls, watching the Virginia elite abandon their plates of seared scallops. The Las Vegas music producer quietly packed his mixing equipment into aluminum road cases and slipped out the side service door. Richard and Victoria remained anchored to the head table. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They simply stared at the blank screen of the digital tablet resting on the silver platter. The illusion of their East Coast royalty was stripped down to the studs, leaving behind two desperate debtors waiting for the authorities. I did not linger on the stage to gloat. I handed the microphone to a passing staff member and walked back up the sweeping staircase toward the owner's suite. I listened to the sound of luxury sedans speeding across the private causeway, fleeing the peninsula. The operation was over. The toxic route was permanently closed. The fallout hit with terrifying precision. 48 hours after the guests fled the tropical resort, the independent auditing firm arrived at my father's corporate headquarters in Virginia. Richard was not sitting at his mahogany desk to offer excuses or shuffle paperwork. He was already sitting in a holding cell. The forensic accountants tore into the ledgers. The phantom vendors and the fake repair invoices my father created unraveled instantly under federal scrutiny. The missing $4 million were identified before the lunch hour. The Department of Justice does not negotiate with disgraced socialites. The federal prosecutor handed down a 40-page indictment. Richard was charged with multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. Victoria was indicted as a co-conspirator, having utilized the stolen funds to purchase her diamond jewelry and fund the country club lifestyle. The judge reviewed the evidence and deemed them both extreme flight risks. Bail was denied. They were remanded to federal custody to await a trial they could no longer afford to fight. The government invoked asset forfeiture laws to recover the stolen corporate capital. Federal agents descended upon the Virginia colonial estate. They taped off the pristine white columns and seized the property. The luxury vehicles were loaded onto flatbed tow trucks. The designer furniture and the imported orchids were auctioned off to satisfy the municipal liens. The manicured hedges and the sweeping gravel driveway were handed over to the bank. My parents spent 30 years cultivating an image of unshakable prosperity, but the truth reduced their legacy to a stack of foreclosure documents. The most poetic justice was reserved for Madison. The golden child found herself thrust into a reality she was entirely unequipped to survive. Trent filed for a legal annulment the Monday following the ruined welcome dinner, citing fraud. He packed his bags and erased Madison from his social media history before the week concluded. Madison tried to leverage her supposed high society network. She reached out to the wealthy bridesmaids and the country club friends she used to entertain. She discovered very quickly that Virginia elite treat federal indictments like a contagion. Nobody returns the phone calls of a woman whose designer wardrobe was funded by stolen logistics dividends. Her own bank accounts were frozen by the government because every dollar she possessed was flagged as the fruit of a poisoned tree. Without her parents' money, Madison had no degree, no usable skills, and no work ethic. The cold mechanics of the real world forced her to accept the only employment she could find. My sister now lives in a cramped studio apartment in a suburb known for its industrial parks. She works the overnight shift at a regional distribution warehouse. She trades her custom silk gowns for a high-visibility vest and steel-toed boots. She stands on a concrete floor for 10 hours a day, scanning barcodes and loading cardboard boxes onto freight pallets for minimum wage. The girl who once demanded free forensic accounting labor now clocks in on a punch card just to afford groceries. My own trajectory moved in the exact opposite direction. The executives who witnessed the confrontation at Azure Cove did not view me with pity. They viewed me with deep, profound respect. They watched a woman stand under a blinding spotlight, absorb the threats of her own mother, and systematically dismantle a criminal conspiracy using flawless data. In the corporate finance sector, unshakable composure is the most valuable currency on the market. My professional reputation skyrocketed. The rumors of elder abuse and moral failure evaporated instantly, replaced by a reputation for terrifying integrity. Board members realized that if I could hold the line against my own family during a coordinated public ambush, I could certainly handle a delayed freight shipment or a hostile vendor negotiation. The senior partner at my accounting firm called me 3 days after the welcome dinner. He did not suggest an indefinite leave of absence. He offered me a senior partnership and handed me the exclusive forensic portfolio for their entire East Coast logistics division. It was the most lucrative contract the firm had ever secured. I optimized my life the exact same way I optimized those shipping routes. I identified the failing components and I cut them out of the network. I resigned from my Virginia apartment lease and relocated permanently to the Florida Keys. I retained my accounting clients operating my forensic firm remotely from the executive offices of the resort. The spring air in South Florida carries a distinct scent of blooming jasmine and warm salt water. It is a sharp, clean smell that clears the mind. I stood on the balcony of the owner's suite holding a mug of black coffee. The sun was just beginning to set over the Atlantic horizon, painting the sky in vibrant shades of gold and bruised purple. Down below the deep water, Marina hummed with quiet activity as a luxury yacht glided toward the docks. The mechanical hum of the resort staff preparing the evening service was nothing more than a faint whisper from this altitude. For the first time in my life, the silence surrounding me was not a threat. It was a reward. The toxic noise of my family had been permanently muted. There were no more frantic phone calls demanding rehearsal dinner deposits. There were no more passive-aggressive texts questioning my loyalty. My cell phone rested on the patio table, silent and still. The siege was over. The fortress had held. I turned away from the railing and walked back inside through the sliding glass doors. The interior of the penthouse was bathed in natural light. The floors warmed my bare feet. I had successfully repurposed a legacy of neglect into an empire of my own. Evelyn handed me the keys to a kingdom, and I ensured the gates remained locked against the parasites who tried to bleed it dry. Looking back at this journey, from the cancelled graduation dinner to the crowded terrace of my own resort, I walked away with 5 hard-won lessons that I will carry forever. First, strength is not an open invitation for exploitation. Just because you are pragmatic and capable of handling life's storms does not give anyone the right to use your resilience as a safety net for their own laziness. Second, silence is a boundary, not a weakness. The 6 months I spent tracking their ledgers were not about pouting. They were about building a case so solid that when the storm finally hit, it could not even shake the front door. Third, loyalty must be earned, not demanded by birthright. A cancelled milestone and a stolen graduation dinner are choices. If someone chooses to be absent during your achievements, you are under no obligation to be present for their emergencies. Fourth, the truth is the ultimate auditor. People can spend 30 years painting a facade of perfection, but the truth does not care about aesthetics. When you live a lie, you are always just one forensic ledger away from total foreclosure. Finally, family is a choice you make every single day. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and firm boundaries make you family. Surround yourself with people who would never dream of asking you to shrink yourself down just so they can feel tall. My name is Destiny Butler, and after 28 years of carrying the weight of an illusion I never asked for, I am finally irrevocably free. I stopped waiting for my parents to see my value and started charging them for the view. If this story spoke to the part of you that has always been told to just understand, while others get to be selfish, I want you to know that your sanctuary is non-negotiable. Thank you for walking this path with me on Senior Echo Stories. If Destiny's journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that stories of resilience and real-world justice matter. Before you go, I want to know, what is the one thing you have done for yourself that made you realize you did not need permission to be happy? Drop your answer in the comments below. I will be reading every single word. Until next time, keep building your own table.